Ha-Yoon Lim never imagined that the man she had built her world around, the man she promised to love forever, would one day stop his car on a deserted highway and tell her to get out. But that night, under the icy malice of a midnight storm, that is exactly what happened. Sang-Wook Choi sat behind the wheel, his expression as cold as the rain hitting the windshield, while his mistress sat in the passenger seat, looking at Ha-Yoon like she was nothing more than a shattered icon of a discarded past. Ha-Yoon stood trembling on the shoulder of the road, the anatomy of a lie finally exposed. "Sang-Wook, please. It's midnight. I have nowhere to go." He didn't even look at her. "Then find somewhere. You're no longer my concern, Ha-Yoon. If you touch this car again, I'll have you arrested for harassment." The door slammed shut, a sound of absolute finality. She watched the red taillights fade into the chilling pale gray mist, leaving her alone in the dark. Shaking and broken, she stumbled toward the center of the road, her eyes blurred by a single, crystal-clear tear. The headlights appeared out of nowhere. The shadow's reflex of a heavy braking system screamed against the asphalt. And then a calculating quiet fell over the highway. "If you're watching this right now, I need your help to prove a point." Someone close to me said that stories of immovable grace and redemption don't resonate anymore, that people don't care about the status collapse of villains like Sang-Wook. But I believe you do. I believe stories about finding an iron shield in the darkest moments deserve to be told. Help me show the world that these tales matter. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of Ha-Yoon's physical ascent. Give this video a like if you're already waiting for Sang-Wook to face his reckoning. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're joining our global family from: the United States, Korea, the UK, Nigeria, or Australia. We love hearing from you. Now, let's continue this emotional journey. Ha-Yoon Lim was not always the woman abandoned on a midnight highway. Years ago, before the hospital noose of her marriage began to tighten, she was a woman of dreams and unburdened vigilance. She had been born into a family that valued legacy, unaware that her path would eventually lead her to the Cathedral of Icy Malice and the most feared man in Seoul, Dante Kwon. The headlights of the obsidian black sedan sliced through the midnight fog like twin surgical lasers, catching the frantic, shimmering trajectory of a single falling tear. For Dante Kwon, time didn't move in seconds. It moved in calculations. From the back seat of his armored vehicle, he watched the world through a veil of lethal calm. He saw the red glint of a retreating car's taillights, a brake line perishment, of a man fleeing the scene of his own moral bankruptcy. Then, his gaze shifted to the center of the asphalt, where a woman stood like a shattered icon, ready to be leveled by the wind. "Stop," Dante commanded. The word was low, a vibration that carried the weight of absolute finality. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the rain-slicked pavement in a shadow's reflex that brought the 2-ton machine to a halt inches from Ha-Yoon Lim. The calculating quiet that followed was heavy, filled only by the rhythmic thrum of the idling engine and the frantic heartbeat of a woman who had nowhere left to run. Dante stepped out into the icy malice of the Seoul rain. He didn't carry an umbrella. The weather didn't dare to inconvenience a man of his iron-forged resolve. His handmade Italian shoes touched the grit and grease of the highway, but he moved with an immovable grace that suggested he owned the very ground beneath him. As he approached Ha-Yoon, he performed a silent audit of the situation. He saw the gray-ribbed sweater soaked through, the anatomy of a lie visible in the way she clutched her own shoulders as if trying to hold the fragments of her soul together. He noted the fatal detail of her glassy, wide-eyed exhaustion. She wasn't just cold, she was experiencing a total status collapse. To the rest of the world, she was a discarded nuisance on a dark road. To Dante, she was a variable that had just rewritten the equation of his night. Ha-Yoon looked up, her vision blurred by the downpour. She didn't see a man. She saw a silhouette of chilling pale gray light and shadow. Dante's hand, marked by the intricate scales of a dragon tattoo that seemed to breathe in the darkness, reached out. It wasn't a gesture of aggression, but one of sovereign protection. "The road is no place for a ghost," Dante said, his voice a precision instrument that cut through the sound of the falling rain. Ha-Yoon tried to speak, but her voice was a deep, agonizing crack. He left. He said I was nothing." Dante's eyes narrowed, a flash of icy malice, directed at the empty road where Sang-Wook had disappeared. He was mistaken. Nothing is a vacuum, and you are far too heavy with grief to be nothing. Without waiting for her consent, he leaned forward, his lethal calm wrapping around her like an iron shield. He lifted her from the cold asphalt, her small frame feeling like a vulnerable giant in his arms. She was shivering, a rhythmic tension that vibrated against his chest, but as he turned back toward the idling car, the hospital noose of the highway began to fade. He placed her into the heated sanctuary of the rear seat, the leather smelling of sovereign luxury and expensive wood smoke. As he sat beside her, the dragon on his hand catching the dim amber glow of the cabin lights, he signaled the driver. "Home," he whispered. The car glided forward, leaving the scene of the betrayal behind. Ha-Yoon leaned her head against the window, watching the shades of gray of the highway disappear. She didn't know who this man was, or why he had pulled her from the dark, but as the warmth of the car began to melt the ice in her bones, she felt the first spark of unburdened vigilance. The Tuesday morning escape she had never planned had begun. Behind them, the highway was empty, but ahead, the Cathedral of Icy Malice waited, a place where her invisibility by design would finally be dismantled by the man the whole city feared. For the first time in years, the anatomy of power was shifting in her favor, and the Iron Architect was already drafting the blueprint for her revenge. The transition from the freezing chaos of the highway to the calculating quiet of the Moon Estate was not a return to life, but an immersion into a different kind of stillness. When Ha-Yoon Lim finally opened her eyes, she didn't find the sterile white walls of a hospital or the familiar, suffocating shadows of her old apartment. Instead, she was met by a Cathedral of Icy Malice, a room of soaring glass and polished obsidian that felt as though it had been carved from the very heart of a mountain. The air was pressurized and cool, carrying the faint, clinical scent of white lilies and expensive floor wax. She lay beneath sheets of heavy, charcoal silk that felt like a sovereign weight against her skin, anchoring her to a reality she didn't yet understand. For a moment, the hospital noose of her memory tightened. She remembered the red taillights of Sang-Wook's car, the grit and grease of the wet asphalt, and the dragon-tattooed hand that had pulled her from the dark. "You're awake." The voice was not Dante's. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to blend into the shades of gray of the room. A woman stepped out from the shadows near the balcony, a figure of disciplined vigilance, dressed in a sharp, slate-colored uniform. This was Iris. Her eyes didn't hold the warmth of a nurse, they held the lethal calm of a sentinel. "Where am I?" Ha-Yoon's voice was a deep, agonizing crack, her throat still raw from the midnight chill. "You are in the east wing of the Moon Estate," Iris replied, moving toward a digital terminal that glowed with a chilling pale gray light. "The architect does not leave things where he finds them. He brought you here because the road was an audit he chose to close." Iris tapped the glass screen of her tablet, and a series of signals began to scroll across the interface, flickering maps of Seoul, bank transaction logs, and grainy CCTV stills. Ha-Yoon watched, a primal desperation rising in her chest as she recognized a familiar face on the screen. It was Sang-Wook. He was caught in a fatal detail of a camera feed at a luxury hotel, looking unburdened and arrogant, a woman's hand draped over his arm. "He thinks you are a shattered icon that he successfully discarded," Iris said, her waitress's eye for detail never leaving the screen. "He spent the last 3 hours celebrating his Tuesday morning escape from your marriage. He has no idea that the signals of his life are already being rerouted." Ha-Yoon felt a slow-burn tension ignite in her blood. Looking at the screen, she realized that her status collapse was being broadcasted in real time to the people in this house. She was a vulnerable giant, exposed to their mastery of control. She moved to sit up, the anatomy of a lie that was her life feeling heavier than ever, but Iris was suddenly there, placing a firm, cool hand on her shoulder. It was a gesture of restraint over ruin. "Do not move yet," Iris commanded. "The architect is performing a clinical sabotage of your husband's entire existence. Every credit card he swipes, every door he unlocks, every paper gamble he makes is being logged. We are not just watching him, Ha-Yoon. We are building the anatomy of power that will eventually crush him." The calculating quiet of the room deepened. Ha-Yoon looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Seoul skyline, which looked like a chandeliered altar in the distance. She was no longer the woman who had been pushed out of a car at midnight. She was a guest in a cathedral built on icy malice and absolute loyalty. As Iris continued to track the digital signals of Sang-Wook's betrayal, Ha-Yoon realized that the iron shield Dante Kwon had promised was not just a roof over her head. It was a promise of a reckoning. She closed her eyes, letting the mastery of control of the estate wrap around her like armor. The hospital noose was gone, and in its place, the Iron Architect was already laying the foundation for a future where Sang-Wook Choi would find himself the one standing in the dark, with nowhere left to run. The calculating quiet of the Moon Estate was interrupted not by a sound, but by a shift in the air as Dante Kwon entered the room. He moved with the lethal calm of a predator returning to a sanctuary, his silhouette cutting through the chilling pale gray, morning light that spilled across the obsidian floors. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he performed a slow, deliberate audit of the situation, his gaze sweeping over Ha-Yoon Lim as she sat on the edge of the silk-laden bed. Ha-Yoon tried to adjust the sleeves of her borrowed robe, a shadow's reflex born from years of invisibility by design. She wanted to pull the fabric down, to maintain the anatomy of a lie she had lived for Sang-Wook Choi, but her hands trembled. The slow-burn tension in the room thickened as Dante stepped closer, his presence acting as an iron shield that seemed to push the walls of the room inward. "Restraint is the management of power, Ha-Yoon," Dante said, his voice a low vibration that felt like a sovereign command. "But you cannot manage what you refuse to acknowledge." He reached out, his hand, adorned with the intricate dragon tattoo that symbolized his mastery of control, moving with a gentleness that contradicted the icy malice in his eyes. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took her wrist, his fingers avoiding the pulse point as he slowly, clinically, pushed back the heavy silk sleeve. The fatal detail was revealed in the harsh light of the morning. Across Ha-Yoon's pale skin were the dark, mottled fingerprints of a status collapse, bruises that told the story of Sang-Wook's final, violent clinical sabotage of her dignity. They were the deep, agonizing crack in her silence, a physical manifestation of the hospital noose she had worn for 3 years. Dante's expression didn't shift into rage. It settled into an absolute finality that was far more terrifying. He traced the edge of a bruise with the tip of his finger, his touch a precision instrument of silent fury. To him, these marks were not just injuries. They were a break-line parishment of Sang-Wook's right to exist in the same city as the Moon Estate. He did this, Dante stated, not as a question, but as a recorded fact in his Audit of the Heart. "It was an accident," Ha-Yoon whispered, her voice a hollow grief that clung to the old scripts of her survival. "He was angry. He didn't mean to. He meant to erase you," Dante interrupted, his chilling pale gray gaze locking onto hers. "He treated you like a shattered icon he could break at will. He believed your invisibility by design made you a target. But in this house, those marks are the signature on his death warrant." Ha-Yoon looked down at her own arm, seeing the bruises through Dante's eyes. For the first time, the anatomy of a lie began to crumble. She saw the grit and grease of her husband's character etched into her own skin. The primal desperation she had felt on the highway was replaced by a cold, iron-forged realization. She had been a vulnerable giant protecting a monster. Dante let go of her wrist, but the warmth of his iron shield remained. He turned toward the window, looking out over the Seoul skyline where Sang-Wook was likely still celebrating his Tuesday morning escape. Sang-Wook Choi believes he has performed a clinical sabotage of your life, Dante said, his voice carrying the weight of a reckoning. He thinks he threw away a piece of trash on a midnight highway. He has no idea that he handed me the only precision instrument I needed to dismantle him. I promise you, Ha-Yoon, by the time the sun sets on this audit, he will find that the ocean is not wide enough to hide from the absolute threat he invited into his life. He turned back to her, his lethal calm, returning like a shadow behind the curtain. Sleep now. When you wake, the physical ascent begins. We are no longer hiding your scars. We are using them as the blueprint for his status collapse. This is no longer a marriage, Ha-Yoon. This is a war, and the Iron Architect has already won. As he stepped out of the room, leaving her in the calculating quiet, Ha-Yoon took her first unburdened breath. The hospital noose had been cut, and the anatomy of power was finally, irrevocably, in her hands. The calculating quiet of the Moon Estate was a living entity, a pressurized silence that Ha-Yoon Lim tried to dissolve into. She moved through the secondary corridors with the mastery of control she had honed over years of avoiding Sang-Wook's unpredictable temper. She sought out the invisibility by design that had once been her only armor, attempting to blend into the rhythmic pulse of the service wing. She reached for a polishing cloth, her fingers itching for the grit and grease of manual labor, something tangible to anchor her to the version of herself she understood. The servant, the ghost, the shattered icon. But in the Cathedral of Icy Malice, even the shadows belonged to Dante Kwon. She had barely begun to scrub the silver when a shadow's reflex behind her made her spine stiffen. Iris stood in the doorway, her expression a mask of lethal calm. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply held out a hand, her gaze noting the fatal detail of Ha-Yoon's trembling fingers. The architect does not employ ghosts to clean his silver, Iris said, her voice a precision instrument of redirected purpose. He requires a partner for the reckoning. You are attempting to shrink in a house built for giants, Ha-Yoon. Ha-Yoon was led, not to the service stairs, but to the chandeliered altar of the main dressing suite. The room was bathed in a chilling pale gray light that reflected off rows of silk and structured wool. On a central obsidian table lay the tools for her physical ascent, garments that didn't hide her, but announced her. I can't wear these, Ha-Yoon whispered, her primal desperation surfacing as she looked at a tailored suit of deep navy silk, the sovereign color of the Kwon house. I'm just a maid in a big house. If I wear this, he'll see me. Sang-Wook will know where I am. That is the point, a voice rumbled from the threshold. Dante stood there, his iron-forged silhouette framing the doorway. He watched her with an audit of the heart, his eyes devoid of pity, but brimming with a cold, protective intent. Your invisibility by design was a survival tactic for a war you were losing. In this city, under my iron shield, you will be seen. You will be the absolute threat that Sang-Wook never saw coming. Dante stepped into the room, his dragon-tattooed hand reaching out to touch the navy silk. The hospital noose of your old life was made of fabric that let you disappear. This silk is a legacy of grace. It is the anatomy of power made manifest. When you put this on, you are no longer the woman who is discarded at midnight. You are the woman who holds the audit of his future. With the disciplined anger of a woman reclaiming her soul, Ha-Yoon allowed Iris to begin the transformation. The gray-ribbed sweater, the last remnant of her status collapse, was discarded. In its place came the sovereign navy, the fabric heavy and cooling against her skin. It didn't feel like clothing. It felt like a shadow behind a curtain being stepped into. The suit fit with a precision that left no room for shrinking. Iris worked on her hair, pulling it back into a severe, elegant bun that exposed the anatomy of a lie etched into her jawline, now held high. The single tear from the highway was gone, replaced by a lethal calm that mirrored Dante's own. When the physical ascent was complete, Ha-Yoon stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She saw a woman she didn't recognize, a pillar of immovable grace. The sleeves and scars were still there, hidden beneath the navy silk, but they no longer felt like secrets. They felt like the iron-forged foundation of a rebirth. Dante approached her from behind, his reflection and absolute finality beside hers. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a possessive protector, gesture that felt like a sovereign seal. "The Tuesday morning escape is over, Ha-Yoon," he murmured into the calculating quiet of the room. "You are no longer hiding in the shades of gray. You are the Iron Architect's masterpiece, and tonight, we begin the clinical sabotage of everything he holds dear." Ha-Yoon met his chilling pale gray gaze in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't look away. The anatomy of power had shifted. She was no longer a ghost. She was the shadow that would soon eclipse Sang-Wook Choi's world. The calculating quiet of the Moon Estate shifted into a different frequency as Dante Kwon initiated the first stage of the reckoning. While Ha-Yoon Lim stood in her sovereign navy silk, feeling the new weight of her own presence, Dante's Wolves, an elite network of digital ghost shifters, began the clinical sabotage of Sang-Wook Choi's reality. In the high-tech hub of the estate, Iris monitored the signals with a lethal calm, watching as the pillars of Sang-Wook's life were systematically dismantled, brick by digital brick. Sang-Wook Choi was currently at a high-end Gangnam lounge, the grit and grease of his infidelity masked by expensive scotch and the chandeliered glow of his new mistress, Yuna. He felt unburdened, believing he had successfully performed a status collapse on Ha-Yoon and left her to fade into the shades of gray of the midnight highway. He was laughing, a precision instrument of arrogance, when the first deep, agonizing crack appeared in his world. He signaled the waiter for another round, sliding his black titanium credit card across the table, a paper gamble he had made 1,000 times before. But this time, the signals returned a red error. "I'm sorry, Mr. Choi," the waiter whispered, his voice a calculating quiet that carried a sudden chill. "The card has been declined. Insufficient funds." Sang-Wook's laugh died, replaced by a primal desperation that flickered behind his eyes. "That's impossible. Try it again. It's an iron-forged line of credit." As the waiter retreated, Sang-Wook pulled out his phone to perform a signals check on his private accounts. His breath hitched, a fatal detail of his growing panic. The screen didn't show his balance. It showed a chilling pale gray notification, account frozen by sovereign mandate. It was an audit of the situation he wasn't prepared for. Miles away, in the Cathedral of Icy Malice, Dante stood behind Ha-Yoon, watching the same data scroll across a wall of monitors. Every time Sang-Wook tried to access a hidden offshore account or a corporate fund, a shadow's reflex from the wolves cut the connection. "He thinks he is losing money," Dante murmured into the calculating quiet of the room, his hand resting on the small of Ha-Yoon's back. "He doesn't realize he is losing his identity. We are not just draining his bank accounts, Ha-Yoon. We are performing a clinical sabotage of his right to exist in our world." Ha-Yoon watched the screen as Sang-Wook's face, captured by a hidden camera in the lounge, shifted from confusion to a wide-eyed exhaustion. She saw him fumble with a second card, then a third, his status collapse, unfolding in front of the very woman he had chosen over her. Yuna's expression was already shifting, the anatomy of a lie in her own affection becoming clear as the grit and grease of Sang-Wook's financial ruin became apparent. "He looks so small," Ha-Yoon whispered, her immovable grace solidifying with every second. "A man who builds his house on the hollow grief of others is always small," Dante replied, his lethal calm an iron shield around her. "He threw you out at midnight because he believed he held the anatomy of power. Now he is learning that the power was never his. It was alone, and the Iron Architect has just called for repayment." By the time the sun began to set over Seoul, Sang-Wook was standing outside the lounge, the hospital noose of his debts tightening with every breath. He tried to call his lawyer, but the signals were dead. His mobile service had been liquidated. He looked at his luxury car, but a team of wolves in unmarked black sedans was already moving in to perform a sovereign repossession. He was being stripped down to the grit and grease of his true self. The clinical sabotage was complete. Sang-Wook Choi, The man who had discarded his wife like a shattered icon was now a ghost in his own city, and the reckoning had only just begun. As Ha-Yoon watched the final signals turn red, she felt the Tuesday morning escape finally reach its destination. She was no longer the victim. She was the silent architect of his fall. The grand ballroom of the Seoul was a chandeliered altar of excess, a sea of shades of gray, silk, and sparkling diamonds where the city's elite gathered to perform their nightly audit of social standing. For Sang-Wook Choi, this gala was supposed to be his iron coronation, the night he introduced Yuna as his new consort and finalized the clinical sabotage of his past with Ha-Yoon. He moved through the crowd with a practiced lethal calm, unaware that the calculating quiet of the room was actually the silence before a reckoning. In the upper balcony, hidden behind a mask of delicate obsidian lace, Ha-Yoon Lim stood like a shadow behind the curtain. She was draped in the sovereign navy of the Kwon house, her posture an immovable grace that made her unrecognizable even to herself. Beside her, Dante Kwon leaned against the marble railing, his dragon-tattooed hand resting near hers, an iron shield that projected a sovereign authority over the entire floor. "Watch the status collapse, Ha-Yoon," Dante murmured, his voice a low vibration that cut through the orchestral hum. A man who builds his reputation on the anatomy of a lie always finds that the floorboards are the first thing to rot. Below them, Sang-Wook approached a group of high-profile investors, his waitress's eye for opportunity gleaming. But as he reached out to shake hands, the signals shifted. The investors didn't smile. They retreated. One by one, phones began to chime throughout the ballroom, a shadow's reflex of digital leaks orchestrated by Dante's wolves. The fatal detail appeared on the massive projection screens intended for the keynote, bank statements showing the grit and grease of Sang-Wook's embezzlement and the anatomy of power he had used to drain his wife's inheritance to fund Yuna's lifestyle. The calculating quiet of the ballroom broke into a deep, agonizing crack of whispers. Sang-Wook froze, his face a mask of wide-eyed exhaustion as he realized his Tuesday morning escape was becoming a public execution. Yuna, standing beside him in a dress that cost more than Ha-Yoon's gray sweater, felt this status collapse instantly. When a group of socialites turned their backs on her with icy malice, she didn't stay to defend him. She performed her own clinical sabotage, dropping Sang-Wook's arm as if he were a shattered icon that had finally turned to dust. "Sang-Wook, I can't be associated with this," Yuna hissed, her voice carrying across the silent floor. She turned and fled into the shades of gray of the exit, leaving him standing alone in the chandeliered glow of his own ruin. From the balcony, Ha-Yoon watched the man who had thrown her out at midnight. He looked small, a vulnerable giant whose hospital noose of lies had finally tightened around his own throat. The primal desperation on his face was a mirror of her own 3 nights ago, but she felt no hollow grief. Instead, she felt the unburdened vigilance of a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows of the estate. "He is looking for a door that no longer exists," Dante said, his chilling pale gray eyes fixed on Sang-Wook's trembling form. Ha-Yoon adjusted her mask, her iron-forged resolve as sharp as the diamonds on her wrists. She didn't need to say a word. The audit of the situation was complete. Sang-Wook Choi had entered the room as a king and would leave as a break-line perishment in the history of Seoul. As the security detail, Dante's men in bespoke black suits, moved in to escort a shouting, broken Sang-Wook from the floor, Ha-Yoon turned away from the railing. She didn't look back at the grit and grease of his downfall. She walked beside Dante toward the private elevators, her physical ascent reaching its peak. The ghost at the gala was gone, and in her place was a woman of sovereign power, ready for the absolute finality of the final move. The calculating quiet of the Moon Estate was shattered not by an external threat, but by the primal desperation of a man who had already lost everything. Sang-Wook Choi, now a shattered icon, wandering the fringes of the city, had reached the stage of absolute finality. He didn't want his money back. He wanted to perform one last clinical sabotage on the woman he believed had caused his status collapse. He waited in the shades of gray, near the estate's secondary exit, a stolen vehicle idling with a rhythmic tension that mirrored his own frayed nerves. When Ha-Yoon's car, a sleek, armored sedan, emerged for a scheduled trip to the Cathedral of Icy Malice hub, Sang-Wook didn't hesitate. He wasn't a precision instrument anymore. He was a brake-line parachment in human form. He forced her vehicle off the road in a chaotic shadows reflex, the screech of metal against metal, a deep, agonizing crack in the morning silence. Before the iron shield of Dante's security could fully react, Sang-Wook was at her door, his face a mask of wide-eyed exhaustion and icy malice. He dragged Ha-Yoon from the seat, his grip a hospital noose around her arm, and forced her into his car. He didn't have a plan, only a destination, the highway where his Tuesday morning escape had first turned into a nightmare. "You think you're a sovereign now?" Sang-Wook spat, his voice a grit and grease, vibration as he floored the accelerator. "You're just a maid playing dress-up in navy silk. You're still the woman I threw away." Ha-Yoon didn't scream. She didn't succumb to hollow grief. Instead, she sat in the passenger seat with an immovable grace that seemed to infuriate him further. She looked at the speedometer as it climbed, the signals of her own fear replaced by a lethal calm. She knew that Dante Kwon's audit of the situation was already in motion. Behind them, the chilling pale gray light of the highway was pierced by the sudden, aggressive glare of LED headlights. Dante's convoy appeared like a shadow behind the curtain moving into the light. The high-speed chase was a precision instrument of pursuit. Dante's lead car, a black leviathan of steel, moved with a mastery of control that Sang-Wook couldn't hope to match. The chase led them deeper into the outskirts, the scenery blurring into shades of gray, until the familiar stretch of the midnight highway appeared. It was as if the universe was demanding an absolute finality at the scene of the original crime. "Stop the car, Sang-Wook," Ha-Yoon said, her voice a sovereign command that cut through the roar of the engine. "The anatomy of a lie is over. You have nowhere left to run." "I'm taking you with me," he shrieked, his primal desperation reaching a fever pitch. But the Iron Architect was already one step ahead. A second black sedan performed a clinical sabotage of Sang-Wook's path, swerving in front and forcing him to slam on the brakes. The car spun, a shadow's reflex of screeching tires and burning rubber, until it came to a halt exactly where the Tuesday morning escape had begun. The calculating quiet returned to the highway, heavier and colder than before. Dante Kwon stepped out of his car, his iron-forged silhouette standing against the mist. He didn't rush. He moved with the lethal calm of a man arriving to collect a debt. Sang-Wook stumbled out of the driver's side, his status collapse now visible for the entire world to see. He looked at Dante, then at Ha-Yoon, who stepped out of the car with the anatomy of power etched into every line of her posture. The hospital noose was gone. The vulnerable giant was dead. "The audit is closed, Sang-Wook," Dante said, his voice an absolute finality that echoed across the dark asphalt. As the wolves moved in to secure the perimeter, Ha-Yoon stood on the shoulder of the road, the icy malice of the wind no longer affecting her. She looked at the spot where she had once stood in a gray sweater, crying and broken. Now, in her sovereign navy silk, she was the one holding the iron shield. The reckoning had returned to its source, and the absolute threat was finally, irrevocably, at an end. The calculating quiet of the midnight highway was different this time. It wasn't the silence of abandonment, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of an audit of the heart. Sang-Wook Choi sat on the cold asphalt, pinned between the headlights of Dante's convoy and the absolute finality of his own ruin. He was a shattered icon, his expensive suit stained with the grit and grease of the road, his primal desperation, now reduced to a pathetic, shivering whimper. Dante Kwon stepped forward, his silhouette an iron shield against the mist. He didn't look at the broken man on the ground. His chilling pale gray gaze was fixed entirely on Ha-Yoon Lim. With a slow, deliberate motion, Dante reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a precision instrument, a sleek, silver-weighted handgun that caught the chandeliered glow of the LED headlights. He held it out to her, the dragon tattoo on his hand seeming to coil around the grip. "This is the anatomy of power, Ha-Yoon," Dante murmured, his voice a low vibration that carried the weight of a sovereign decree. "He tried to perform a clinical sabotage on your soul. He left you here to be erased by the dark. Now, this shadow behind the curtain has delivered him to you. End the hospital noose once and for all." Ha-Yoon looked at the weapon, then at the man who had once been her world. Sang-Wook looked up at her, his eyes filled with a wide-eyed exhaustion that mirrored her own from nights ago. For a heartbeat, the shadow's reflex surged within her. She felt the ruthless urge to bridge the gap between them, to use this absolute finality to silence the voice that had told her she was nothing. It would be a clinical sabotage of the ghost that haunted her dreams. But then, the chandeliered altar of her memory opened. She heard the phantom whisper of Master Kalen, a legacy of grace she was finally ready to embrace. Mastery is not the ability to ruin another, Ha-Yoon. It is the strength to remain iron-forged when the fire is at its hottest. She looked at her hands, hands that were no longer shaking, hands draped in the sovereign navy silk of a woman who had found home and solace. If she pulled that trigger, she wouldn't be stepping into her power. She would be stepping back into the grit and grease of Sang-Wook's world. She would be letting his icy malice define her forever. With an immovable grace that felt like a physical ascent, Ha-Yoon reached out. But she didn't take the weapon. Instead, she gently pushed Dante's hand away, her touch a signals, check of her own newfound peace. "He isn't worth the stain on my soul, Dante," she said, her voice steady and forged and unbreakable. "To kill him would be a status collapse of everything I've become. He wanted me to be invisible, to be a ghost. If I take his life, I'm just another shadow in his theater of cruelty." She turned her gaze to Sang-Wook, her lethal calm, far more terrifying than any weapon. "I don't hate you, Sang-Wook. Hate is a tether, and I am finally cutting the line. You are a break-line perishment in my story. Nothing more." Dante watched her, an audit of the situation, reflecting in his eyes. He didn't look disappointed. He looked satisfied, as if he had just witnessed the final, iron coronation of her spirit. He signaled to the wolves waiting in the periphery. "The law will perform the clinical sabotage for us," Dante stated, his voice an absolute finality. "Fraud, embezzlement, and the fatal detail of your kidnapping attempt. You will find that a prison cell has a calculating quiet all its own." As the authorities, prompted by signals from Dante's network, arrived to haul Sang-Wook into the shades of gray of a police van, Ha-Yoon didn't watch him go. She turned back toward the Iron Architect, her unburdened vigilance complete. She had chosen restraint over ruin, and in doing so, she had performed the ultimate audit of her own strength. The hospital noose hadn't just loosened, it had vanished. She was no longer running from the midnight highway, she was walking away from it forever. The calculating quiet of the Moon estate had shifted, no longer a pressurized silence of icy malice, but a profound, resonant peace. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand terrace was a chandeliered glow of gold and honey, illuminating a world that had finally stopped vibrating with slow-burn tension. Ha-Yoon Lim stood at the center of the terrace, her silhouette sharp against the rising Seoul sun. She was no longer dressed in the invisibility by design of a dark maid's uniform or the borrowed robes of a victim. Instead, she wore a structured suit of deep navy silk, a sovereign garment that draped over her shoulders like a legacy forged in iron. She looked down at her wrists, now bare and exposed to the cool morning air. The anatomy of a lie was gone. The scars remained, but they had lost their power to make her shrink. They were no longer fatal details of a victim's history, but the iron-forged evidence of a survivor's physical ascent. She didn't feel the need for long sleeves or the hospital noose of protective vigilance. For the first time since that midnight ejection on the highway, her breathing was entirely, permanently unburdened. A soft footfall broke the silence, the rhythmic, lethal calm of someone who no longer needed to haunt the shades of gray. Dante Kwon stepped onto the terrace, his chilling pale gray eyes softening as they landed on her. He didn't approach her as a master or a protector, but as a man who had finally found the missing variable in his own anatomy of power. He stood beside her, his presence an iron shield that she no longer needed for survival, but chose for companionship. "The city is quiet today," Dante murmured, his voice a low vibration of absolute finality. "The shadow behind the curtain has confirmed that the threat has been liquidated. Sang-Wook Choi is now just a break-line parchment in the legal archives. There are no more ghosts, Ha-Yoon. Only the future we architect." Ha-Yoon turned to him, her wide-eyed exhaustion replaced by the immovable grace of a woman who had reclaimed her sense of self. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his coat, not in a lesson in obedience, but in a sovereign alliance. The status collapse of her old life had cleared the ground for this iron coronation, a reality where she was not a ghost, but a pillar. "I spent years running from shadows," she said, her voice steady and forged and unbreakable. "I thought solace was a place I had to find. I didn't realize it was a version of myself I had to become. Sang-Wook didn't just throw me out of a car. He threw me into the only life where I could actually breathe." Dante placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of sovereign protection that felt like a homecoming. They stood together, looking out over a city that was no longer a labyrinth of grit and grease, but a canvas for their shared mastery of control. The anatomy of a lie was over. Ha-Yoon Lim was not invisible. She was not hiding. She was the iron shield of the Kwon Empire, loved completely and protected fiercely. As the sun climbed higher, casting away the last shades of gray from the midnight highway, the Iron Architect and his partner descended into the light of the city. Moving together, they stepped into a reckoning that promised only peace, leaving the hospital noose of the past in the dust behind them. Ha-Yoon was no longer a stranger who didn't belong. She was the woman the whole city admired, and she never looked back, not even once. The core lesson learned: surviving an abusive environment often requires one to become invisible to avoid conflict. The story teaches that while this is a survival tool, true healing requires a physical ascent, the conscious decision to be seen and to reclaim space in the world. Real power is not the ability to dominate others, but the mastery of control over one's own responses and environment. Seeking absolute finality through revenge often keeps a person tethered to their past. Choosing restraint over ruin demonstrates that true victory is becoming so iron-forged that the oppressor no longer has the power to provoke you into becoming like them. It educates the audience on the signals of an unhealthy relationship, such as the hospital noose of emotional isolation, and the importance of an audit of the heart to recognize when a partner is liquidating one's self-worth. While external help, Dante, is a catalyst, the transformation is internal. The story teaches that solace is not a destination provided by someone else, but a state of being achieved through the audit of one's own strength and the refusal to remain a shattered icon. Stay blessed, like and subscribe for the next twist.